The dungeon smelled of damp stone and ancient magic, a combination that had become as familiar to Liana as her own heartbeat. She descended the spiral staircase with practiced ease, her healing satchel bouncing against her hip, a single candle lighting her way through the oppressive darkness. Most Omegas would have been terrified to make this journey alone, especially at this hour when the palace above slept, and the only sounds were the distant dripping of water and the occasional scurrying of rats. But Liana had made this trek every night for the past 6 months, and fear had long since given way to something far more complicated. The guards at the bottom of the stairs barely acknowledged her anymore. They had stopped asking questions after the first week, stopped wondering why a low-ranking Omega healer insisted on tending to a patient who would never wake, who could never appreciate her care. They simply unlocked the reinforced door and let her pass, returning to their card game as if she were just another shadow passing through their domain. Liana supposed that in many ways she was, an invisible presence in a forgotten corner of the palace, caring for a forgotten king. The cell at the end of the corridor was unlike any other in the dungeon, carved with protective runes that glowed faintly blue in the darkness, reinforced with ironwood beams that could supposedly withstand the strength of 10 alphas, and sealed with a magical barrier that hummed with barely contained power. Inside that cell lay the reason for all these precautions: Alpha King Cale Thornheart, or what was left of him. The stories said he had been the most powerful alpha in 5 generations, a warrior king who had united the fractured wolf packs under his rule through a combination of strategic brilliance and raw dominance. They also said he had been cruel, that his temper was as legendary as his strength, that he had executed those who displeased him without mercy or remorse. Then came the Battle of Crimson Valley, the turning point that had changed everything. The details were murky, obscured by conflicting reports and official denials, but the outcome was undeniable. Something had happened on that battlefield, something that had triggered a transformation unlike anything the kingdom had ever witnessed. Cale had shifted into his wolf form and simply never stopped shifting, his body continuing to grow and mutate until he was no longer wolf or man, but something in between, a massive beast driven by rage and pain. He had torn through friend and foe alike before the court mages had managed to subdue him, putting him into an enchanted sleep from which he had never awakened. That had been 6 months ago, and in all that time Cale had not moved, had not opened his eyes, had shown no sign of consciousness whatsoever. The official position was that he was being kept alive until the mages could find a cure for his condition, but Liana had heard the whispers in the palace corridors. They were waiting for him to die, waiting for the problem to resolve itself, so that his younger brother could officially take the throne. No one actually wanted Cale to wake up. No one except perhaps Liana herself, though she could not have explained why even if asked. She approached the barrier carefully, speaking the password the head mage had given her, watching as the magic parted like a curtain to allow her entry. The cell beyond was larger than most, almost a chamber really, with a high ceiling and walls lined with more protective runes. In the center of the space, chained to the floor with enchanted manacles, lay the beast. Even in sleep he was terrifying, easily twice the size of a normal alpha wolf, his fur a midnight black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was caught somewhere between human and animal, his features noble even in their distortion, his body a mass of muscle and barely contained power. Liana had been afraid the first time. She had seen him, had nearly dropped her healing supplies and fled, despite the assurances that he could not wake, could not hurt her. But then she had seen the scars, the evidence of old wounds that had healed poorly, the fresh injuries from the battle that had brought him to this state. She had seen the way his massive chest rose and fell with each breath, the slight tremors that occasionally ran through his limbs, the way his fingers would sometimes flex, as if reaching for something in his dreams. And she had realized that beneath the monster was still a person, trapped and suffering, with no one to care whether he lived or died. So she had stayed, had cleaned his wounds with gentle hands, had applied healing salves to the places where the chains rubbed his skin raw, had made sure he remained as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. The head healer had assigned her to this duty as a punishment, thinking that the lonely and frightening work would teach the young Omega to keep her opinions to herself. But Liana had never minded solitude, had always preferred the company of the sick and injured to the political games of the healthy, and somewhere along the way, her nightly visits had become less about duty and more about something she could not quite name. Tonight she set about her usual routine, first checking the manacles to ensure they had not caused any new injuries, then examining the runes to make sure none had faded or been damaged. She drew fresh water from the enchanted fountain in the corner, water that was kept pure by magic and would not sicken him despite his inability to properly drink. She moistened a cloth and carefully cleaned his face, wiping away the accumulated grime and sweat. Her touch as gentle as if she were handling delicate glass. His fur was coarse beneath her fingers, but somehow still soft, and she found herself running her hand along his jaw in a gesture that was more comfort than medical necessity. Then she began to sing, her voice soft and melodic in the quiet cell. The old songs her grandmother had taught her when she was just a pup, lullabies in the ancient tongue, words of protection and peace, melodies that were said to soothe even the most troubled spirits. She sang as she worked, cleaning the suppurating wound on his shoulder where a sword had cut deep, applying fresh bandages to the claw marks across his ribs, checking his temperature and pulse with the practiced efficiency of a trained healer. The beast never responded, never gave any indication that he heard or felt anything. But Liana sang anyway. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that inside the prison of his own body, Cale Thornhart heard every word. He existed in a state of nightmarish awareness, conscious but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but experience the endless loop of his own memories. He relived the battle constantly, saw the faces of the wolves he had killed, felt the moment when something inside him had broken and the beast had taken over completely. He remembered the screams, the blood, the feeling of bones crushing between his jaws, and he knew with absolute certainty that he deserved this fate, that he deserved to be trapped forever in this darkness, with only his guilt for company. But then she had started coming, this Omega, whose name he had learned from listening to her talk to herself, whose voice had become the only beautiful thing in his entire existence. At E. First he had resented her presence, had wished she would leave him alone with his deserved suffering. But she kept returning, night after night, her hands gentle where the world had been cruel, her voice soft, where his life had been filled with harsh commands and harsher consequences. She sang to him, and slowly the nightmares began to recede during those precious hours, replaced by the simple comfort of her presence. He learned things about her through her one-sided conversations, learned that she had been orphaned young and raised by her grandmother, that she loved healing but hated the politics of the palace, that she believed even the most broken things could be mended with enough patience and care. She told him stories about the world outside his cell, about the changing seasons he could not see, about the small dramas of palace life that continued without him. She talked to him as if he were a person rather than a monster, and something deep inside him began to shift in response. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your support means everything and helps me continue creating these tales for you. Tonight, Liana seemed more thoughtful than usual, her movements slower, her song tinged with melancholy. When she finished her medical examination, she did not immediately leave as she sometimes did. Instead, she settled herself on the floor beside his massive head, her back against the cold stone wall, her small hand resting gently on the fur of his neck. Kyle could feel that touch, one of the few sensations that penetrated the paralysis, and he focused on it with desperate intensity, using it to anchor himself to reality. She began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are talking about declaring you dead," she said, and Cale felt something lurch inside him. Not fear for himself, but a strange panic at the thought of never hearing her voice again. "Your brother will be crowned next month if you do not wake. The mages say there is no hope, that the transformation was too severe, that even if they could wake you, you would still be the beast." She paused, and he heard her sigh, a sound so sad it made something in his chest ache. "I do not want you to die," she continued. "I know that probably makes me foolish. You were not a good king, from what I have heard. You were cruel, and you hurt people. And maybe you deserve this fate, but I have been caring for you for half a year now, and I cannot help but think that there must be more to you than the stories say. No one is only one thing, only darkness, or only light. We are all mixtures, all capable of both great evil and great good. Cale wanted to weep, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he was exactly as dark as the stories claimed, that her compassion was wasted on someone like him, but he could not move, could not speak, could only listen as she continued. My grandmother used to say that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, she told him, her fingers stroking gently through his fur. That no one is beyond saving if they truly wish to change. I do not know if you can hear me, if you are even still in there somewhere. But if you are, I want you to know that I would help you if I could. I would give you that chance. She stayed with him longer than usual that night, her presence a comfort he knew he did not deserve but craved desperately anyway, when she finally left, whispering a soft goodbye as she always did. Kyle was left alone with thoughts that had been shifting and changing ever since she first entered his cell. He had accepted his fate, had believed he deserved to suffer for his crimes, but her words had planted a seed of something dangerous in his mind, not hope exactly, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. The weeks that followed took on a strange new quality. Liana continued her nightly visits, but there was an urgency to them now, a sense. That time was running out. She worked faster, stayed longer, talked more freely about the political maneuvering happening above them. Cale's brother Dominic was consolidating power, removing anyone loyal to Cale from positions of influence, making it clear that the old king's reign was over, even if his body still drew breath. There was talk of moving Cale somewhere else, somewhere more remote, or perhaps simply letting him fade away from lack of care. But there were other whispers too, darker, ones that Liana picked up from the guards when they thought she was not listening. Some of Dominic's advisors were suggesting that waiting for nature to take its course was too slow, too uncertain. Better to handle the problem more directly, to ensure that Cale would never wake to challenge his brother's claim to the throne. Liana heard these whispers and felt cold fear settle in her stomach. Not for herself, but for the beast in the cell who had somehow become precious to her. She began taking extra precautions, checking his food and water for poison, examining the magical barriers for signs of tampering, sleeping in short intervals during the day so she could spend more time watching over him at night. The other healers thought she had gone mad, obsessed with a patient who could not be saved. But Liana did not care what they thought. She knew what she felt, knew that the bond between them was real, even if it existed only in her own heart and in the mind of a king who could not respond. It was on a night 3 weeks before Dominic's planned coronation that everything changed. Liana descended the stairs as usual, but something felt wrong from the moment she entered the dungeon. The guards were not at their post. The corridor was too quiet, and when she reached Cale's cell, she found the door standing open, the magical barrier disabled. Her heart hammering with fear, she rushed inside and found 3 figures in dark cloaks standing over Cale's chained body. One of them, holding a vial of something that glowed an ominous green in the candlelight. She did not think, did not pause to consider that she was one small omega against 3 unknown assailants. She simply threw herself between them and Cale, her arms spread wide, her voice ringing out with more authority than she had ever mustered in her life. Stop. Whatever you are planning, I will not let you hurt him. The figures turned toward her, and she caught a glimpse of cruel smiles beneath their hoods. One of them laughed, a sound without humor. Foolish Omega, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You think you can stop us? We have orders from the top, orders to ensure that the beast never wakes. Stand aside or share his fate. But Liana did not move. Could not have moved even if she wanted to. She thought of all the nights she had spent caring for Cale, all the hours she had talked to him and sang to him, and believed in the possibility of his redemption. She thought of his suffering, of the nightmares she knew plagued him, even though he could not speak of them, of the life that still flickered within his massive frame. and she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die than let them harm him. The man with the vial stepped forward, clearly intending to push her aside, and in that moment of desperation, Liana did the only thing she could think of. She threw herself across Cale's chest, her arms wrapping around his massive neck, her body a shield between him and those who would kill him. She pressed her face against his fur and whispered words she had never said aloud before, words that came from the deepest part of her heart. "Please," she breathed. "Please do not leave me. I need you. I know you are in there somewhere. I know you can hear me. Please wake up. Please fight." And inside his prison, Cale heard her. He heard the fear in her voice, felt the wetness of her tears soaking into his fur, sensed the danger she was in because of him. Something inside him roared. To life. Something that had been dormant since the moment the mages had forced him into sleep. This Omega, this beautiful, gentle, impossibly brave Omega, was risking her life for him, for a monster who had done nothing to deserve her care, and that realization, that understanding of what her compassion truly meant, was like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for far too long. The beast responded to her touch, to her desperate plea, to the love he could feel emanating from her small body. Power surged through him, wild and primal. The same power that had transformed him on the battlefield, but directed now not by rage, but by the overwhelming need to protect what was his. The enchanted manacles shattered like glass, the chains that had held him for 6 months falling away, as if they were made of paper. His eyes, closed for so long, suddenly opened, glowing with a fierce amber light that illuminated the entire cell. The assassin stumbled backward in shock as Cale rose to his feet, his massive form towering over them, a growl building in his chest that shook the very stones of the dungeon. But he did not attack, did not lose himself to the beast as he had before. Instead, he carefully, gently moved Liana behind him with one massive paw, placing himself between her and the threat. His message was clear. If they wanted to reach her, they would have to go through him first, and that was a battle they had no hope of winning. They ran, dropping the vial of poison in their haste to escape, their footsteps echoing down the corridor as they fled. Cale watched them go, every muscle in his body tensed and ready, but he did not pursue, because the moment the danger had passed, the moment he was certain they were gone, he felt something shifting inside him again. The beast that had controlled him for so long was receding, its purpose fulfilled, and for the first time since the battle, Cale felt the edges of his human consciousness truly returning. The transformation was agonizing, his body convulsing as bones reshaped and muscles reformed, fur receding to reveal scarred skin beneath. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from the sudden return of full awareness. And through it all, he felt Liana's hands on him, heard her voice speaking words of comfort and encouragement, felt her small body pressed against his, as if she could somehow hold him together through sheer force of will. When it was finally over, when he lay trembling and weak, on the cold stone floor, he was human again for the first time in 6 months. His body was ravaged by the transformation, covered in scars and old wounds, weak from months of immobility and magical sleep, but his mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years, and the first thing he saw when he managed to open his eyes was Liana's face hovering over his, tears streaming down her cheeks, her expression a mixture of joy and disbelief. "You came back," she whispered, her hands cupping his face as if to convince herself he was real. "You actually came back." Kyle tried to speak, his voice a rough croak after months of disuse. "You saved me," he managed, each word an effort but necessary to say. "Why? You knew what I was, what I had done. Why would you risk yourself for me?" Liana smiled through her tears, and it was the most beautiful thing Cale had ever seen, because everyone deserves a chance at redemption, she said, echoing the words she had spoken to him so many nights ago when she thought he could not hear, because I believed there was more to you than the darkness. And I was right. You could have killed those men, could have given in to the beast again, but you did not. You protected me instead. That means something. Before Kale could respond, before he could begin to process everything that had happened, the sound of running footsteps filled the corridor. Guards poured into the cell, weapons drawn, clearly responding to reports of Kale's awakening. But they stopped short when they saw the scene before them. The king lying weak and human on the floor, the Omega healer kneeling protectively beside him, the broken chains and shattered manacles evidence of what had transpired. The captain of the guard, a grizzled alpha named Marcus, who had served under Kale's father, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty," he said, his tone uncertain. "What has happened here?" Kale summoned every ounce of strength he had, forcing himself to sit up despite the protests of his battered body. "There were assassins," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "3 of them, sent to kill me while I was helpless. This Omega saved my life at great risk to her own. I want them found and questioned, and I want to know who sent them." Marcus's expression hardened, and he turned to bark orders at his men. Half of them ran off to begin the search while the others remained. Though their weapons were now lowered, Kyle felt their eyes on him, saw the fear and uncertainty in their faces, and he understood. They had known him as a tyrant, as a king who ruled through intimidation and violence. They had no reason to trust that his transformation was anything more than physical. He looked at Liana, at this Omega who had shown him more kindness than he had ever deserved, and he made a decision that would change everything. "I owe you my life," he told her, his voice clear enough for everyone in the cell to hear. "More than that, I owe you my soul. You cared for me when no one else would, spoke to me when I was lost in darkness, believed in me when I'd given up on myself. I heard every word you said to me during those months, every song you sang, every story you told. You were my light in the darkness, and I swear to you now that I will spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of the faith you placed in me." The cell was utterly silent, every person present staring at their king in shock. This was not the Kale they remembered, not the cold and cruel alpha who had ruled with an iron fist. This was someone changed, someone humbled, and they did not know how to respond. Liana, however, simply smiled and took his hand in hers, her touch gentle, but her grip firm. "Then let us start now," she said softly. "Let us begin the work of becoming who we were meant to be. If you are loving this journey of redemption and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment telling me what you think. Kale should do first to prove he has changed." The days that followed were chaotic and dangerous. The assassins were captured before they could leave the palace grounds, and under questioning they revealed that they had been hired by members of Dominic's inner circle, though whether Dominic himself had ordered the hit remained unclear. The revelation sent shockwaves through the court, splitting the nobility into factions. Those who supported Dominic's claim to the throne, those who remained loyal to Kale despite his absence, and those who simply wanted stability regardless of who wore the crown. Kale found himself in an impossible position. He was weak from months of immobility, his body still recovering from the trauma of his transformation and return. His reputation was that of a monster and a tyrant, and many in the kingdom would have preferred him to remain asleep or simply die. His own brother was maneuvering against him, and he had no way of knowing how deep the conspiracy went or who he could truly trust. By all rights, he should have been focused entirely on securing his throne, on crushing his enemies and reasserting his dominance. But the Kale who had awakened was not the same man who had fallen on that battlefield. The months trapped in his own mind, forced to confront his crimes and failures, had changed him fundamentally, and Liana's unwavering compassion had shown him that there was another way to lead, another way to be. So instead of immediately declaring himself king again and demanding obedience, he did something that shocked everyone. He called a council. He invited representatives from every faction, from Dominic's supporters to his own former allies to the common wolves who had no voice in palace politics. He stood before them, still weak and scarred, with Liana at his side, and he spoke with an honesty that was completely unlike his former self. "I have done terrible things," he began, his voice carrying through the great hall. "I have been cruel and unjust, have ruled through fear rather than respect, have caused suffering to those I should have protected. During the Battle of Crimson Valley, I lost control completely, and innocent wolves died because I could not master the darkness within me. I do not ask you to forget these things or to forgive them easily. I ask only for the chance to prove that I can change, that I can become the king you deserve, rather than the tyrant you have known. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs, but Kale was not finished. He outlined a series of reforms, changes to the laws that had made life so harsh for Omegas and lower-ranked wolves. He proposed a council of advisors drawn from all levels of society, not just the noble families. He acknowledged the legitimate grievances that had been building during his reign and committed to addressing them. And most importantly, he did something no Alpha King had done in generations. He admitted he did not have all the answers, that he would need help and guidance to rule justly. It was a masterful political move, but it was also completely sincere. Kale had no interest in returning to the king he had been. That man had been empty, driven by pride and anger, respected only through fear. He wanted to build something different, something better. But he knew he could not do it alone. And so he looked to Lyanna, to the Omega who had saved him in every way a person could be saved, and he asked her to stay by his side, not as his subject, but as his partner. Lyanna was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. She was just a healer, an orphaned Omega with no political experience or noble blood. But she had spent 6 months learning who Kale truly was beneath the monster, had seen his capacity for change and growth, and she believed in him with a conviction that went beyond reason. So she agreed, and together they began the difficult work of transformation. Not everyone was pleased with Kale's return or his new approach to ruling. Dominic and his faction argued that the king was weak, that his time as the beast had damaged his mind, that the kingdom needed strong leadership, not philosophical debates about justice and reform. They pointed to Kale's admission of wrongdoing as evidence that he was unfit to rule, conveniently ignoring their own role in the attempted assassination. The conflict came to a head when Dominic formally challenged Kale's right to the throne, demanding a trial by combat as was his right under the old laws. Kale was still weak, his body not fully recovered, and everyone knew that Dominic was a formidable fighter in his prime. It seemed like suicide to accept the challenge, and many of Kale's advisors begged him to refuse, to find another way to settle the dispute. But Kale understood that this was about more than just power. It was about proving that he had truly changed, that he was willing to risk everything for what was right. So he accepted, with one condition: the combat would be fought in human form, without weapons, and would end at first blood rather than death. He would not become the beast again, would not allow himself to be consumed by violence no matter the cost. The day of the trial arrived, and the entire court gathered to witness the confrontation. Kale entered the ring, knowing he was at a disadvantage, knowing that Dominic was faster and stronger, and had not spent months chained in a dungeon. But he also entered with something his brother did not have: a reason to fight that went beyond personal ambition. He fought for Lyanna, for the future they were trying to build together, for all the wolves who had suffered under his old rule and deserved better. The combat was brutal and hard fought. Dominic was indeed the superior fighter, landing blow after blow, driving Kale back again and again. But Kale had learned something during his months as the beast, had learned how to endure pain and suffering without losing himself to rage. He absorbed Dominic's attacks, waited for his openings, and fought with a discipline and control he had never possessed before. And when he finally managed to land a solid hit that drew blood from his brother's lip, ending the combat, the victory was not in dominating his opponent, but in proving he could master himself. Dominic had no choice but to accept the outcome, though his expression made it clear the conflict was far from over. But the trial had accomplished what Kale needed. It had shown the court that he was still strong enough to lead while also demonstrating his commitment to a different kind of strength, one based on control and principle rather than raw dominance. It was a beginning, a foundation on which to build. The months that followed were a time of intense change and challenge. Kale threw himself into the work of reform with the same intensity he had once devoted to conquest and intimidation. He met with representatives from the Omega communities, listening to their grievances and working with them to craft new laws that protected their rights and dignity. He established programs to help wolves who had been harmed by his previous policies, offering restitution and apologies that were genuine, even if they could never fully make amends for the damage done. It was not easy, and there were many who resisted the changes, who benefited from the old system and did not want to see it dismantled. Kyle faced opposition from within his own court, assassination attempts from those who preferred him dead, and the constant challenge of overcoming his own instincts and habits. There were times when he wanted to simply order compliance, to force the changes through with alpha dominance and threats. But each time he felt that impulse, he would look at Liana and remember why he was doing this. Remember that true leadership was not about forcing others to obey, but about inspiring them to follow. Liana became his anchor and his conscience, the one person who could speak truth to him without fear. She challenged him when his old habits resurfaced, supported him when the weight of leadership became too heavy, and loved him with a fierce loyalty that never wavered even in the darkest moments. She also became a leader in her own right, using her position to advocate for healers and omegas, to ensure that the voices of those who had been silenced were finally heard. Their relationship deepened and evolved, moving from the strange bond forged in the dungeon to something richer and more complex. Kyle courted her properly, with a patience and tenderness that surprised everyone who had known him before. He learned her favorite flowers and brought them to her, learned the songs she loved and would hum them while they worked together, learned the ways she took comfort and made sure to provide them. He was not perfect. His temper still flared sometimes, and his instincts still pulled him toward dominance. But he was trying, genuinely and constantly trying to be better. And Liana saw that effort, valued it more than any grand gesture or expensive gift. She saw the man beneath the beast, the alpha who was fighting every day to overcome his own nature and become something greater. When he finally asked her to be his mate, his queen, she said yes without hesitation, knowing that their bond was built on a foundation of understanding and transformation that could weather any storm. The mating ceremony was unlike any the kingdom had seen before. Instead of the traditional display of alpha dominance and omega submission, it was a partnership ceremony with vows that spoke of mutual respect and shared responsibility. Kale marked Liana as his mate, with reverence and joy, and she marked him in return, the two of them claiming each other as equals before all the assembled witnesses. It was scandalous to the traditionalists, and inspiring to those who had hoped for change, a symbol of the new kingdom they were building together. But their work was far from over. Dominic and his supporters continued to plot and scheme, looking for any opportunity to undermine Kale's rule. There were external threats as well, neighboring kingdoms who saw the reforms as weakness and considered invasion. And there was the constant challenge of maintaining the balance between Kale's alpha nature and his determination not to become the tyrant he had been. The beast still lived within him, a part of his nature that could never be fully eliminated, and learning to coexist with it, rather than be controlled by it, was an ongoing struggle. Through it all, Liana remained his partner and his guide. When the pressures of ruling threatened to overwhelm him, she would take him back to the dungeon where they had first truly met, now converted into a private sanctuary rather than a prison. There, in the quiet darkness, she would sing to him as she had done when he was the beast, her voice a reminder of how far they had both come, and Kale would hold her close, grateful beyond words for the Omega, who had refused to give up on him, even when he had given up on himself. Years passed, and the kingdom transformed along with its king. The reforms that had seemed so radical at first became accepted practice, and a new generation of wolves grew up knowing a different kind of leadership. Omegas served in positions of power, their voices valued rather than dismissed. Laws were based on justice rather than the whims of the powerful, and while there was still conflict and struggle, while perfection remained an impossible goal, there was also hope and progress and the sense that things were moving in the right direction. Kyle never forgot what he had been, never allowed himself to become complacent or believe that his transformation was complete. He knew that darkness still lived within him, that the beast could rise again if he stopped fighting to control it, but he also knew that he was not alone in that fight, that Liana stood beside him always, her love and faith a constant reminder of why the struggle was worth it. They had pups eventually, children who grew up knowing their father as a reformed king rather than a tyrant, who learned from both their parents that leadership was about service and sacrifice rather than power and privilege. And when those children asked about their parents' story, about how an Omega healer and a beast king had found each other, Kale and Liana would tell them the truth, that love had not magically fixed everything, had not erased the past or made the hard work unnecessary, but had given them both a reason to become better than they were, a foundation on which to build a future worth fighting for. Before we conclude, I would love to hear from you. What part of Kale and Liana's story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The coronation of their eldest daughter years later was a moment of profound reflection for Kale. He stood beside Liana, now his queen and partner of many years, and watched as their child prepared to take on the responsibilities of leadership. She had her mother's compassion and her father's strength, but more than that, she had grown up in a kingdom that valued both, that understood that true power came from the balance of firmness and kindness. As the crown was placed on her head, Kale felt Liana's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture as familiar as breathing. He looked at her, at the Omega who had saved him in every way that mattered, and he saw his entire life reflected in her eyes, the darkness he had been, the light she had shown him, the long and difficult journey they had walked together, and the future that stretched before them still full of challenges and possibilities. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "For everything. For seeing who I could be when all I could see was what I was. For refusing to give up on me. For loving me enough to demand I become better." Liana smiled, the same smile that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his transformation. And she leaned her head against his shoulder. "You did the work," she reminded him gently. "I just believed you could. The rest was always up to you." And perhaps that was the real lesson of their story, the truth that made it worth telling. That redemption was possible but never easy. That love could inspire change but could not force it. That becoming better than you were required constant effort and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. That monsters could become men again, but only if they chose to fight the darkness within themselves every single day. As they left the coronation hall, walking together through the palace that had once been a place of fear and cruelty, but had become something better, Kale thought about that night in the dungeon so many years ago, the night when a small Omega had thrown herself between him and death, had whispered words of belief and hope to a beast who had thought himself beyond saving. That single act of compassion had changed everything, had set in motion a transformation that had reshaped an entire kingdom. He thought about all the nights she had returned to him, singing her songs and telling her stories, maintaining her faith even when he could give her nothing in return. And he understood that this was what true love looked like. Not the passionate intensity of romance stories, but the quiet, consistent choice to see the best in someone and help them reach for it. It was unglamorous and difficult, and required more strength than he had ever needed in battle. But it was also the most powerful force he had ever encountered. They reached their private chambers, the rooms they had shared for years, filled with memories and the comfortable familiarity of a life built together. Kyle pulled Liana into his arms, holding her close as he had done countless times before, and he marveled at how she still fit perfectly against him, how her presence still had the power to calm the beast that lived beneath his skin. "I would have been lost without you," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "I would have died in that dungeon. Or worse, I would have lived as a monster forever. You gave me back my life, my humanity, my future. How can I ever repay that?" Liana pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes bright with love and a hint of mischief. "You repay it every day," she said simply. by being the man I always knew you could be, by leading with wisdom instead of fear, by loving me and our children with all your heart, by remembering where you came from and never going back to that darkness. That is all I have ever wanted from you. And you have given it to me freely." They stood together in the fading light, two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, who had built something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy and pain. And as Cale kissed his mate, his queen, his savior, he knew with absolute certainty that every moment of suffering, every night trapped in the darkness, every difficult step on the path to redemption had been worth it to arrive at this moment. This life, this love, the beast still lived within him, would always be a part of who he was, but it no longer controlled him, no longer defined him. He had learned to harness its strength while refusing its cruelty, to acknowledge its existence while not allowing it to rule his choices. And he had
learned that the greatest victories were not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when he chose compassion over anger, patience over dominance, love over fear. As night fell over the kingdom, Kyle and Liana stood at their window, looking out over the city that had transformed along with them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, the ancient song of their kind echoing through the darkness, but it was no longer a sound of menace or warning. It was simply a reminder of who they were, what they had overcome, and the wild beauty that lived in their hearts alongside their hard-won humanity. And in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, they were content. The journey was not over, would never truly be over as long as they lived. There would be more challenges, more struggles, more moments when the darkness threatened to return, but they would face them together, Alpha and Omega, king and queen. Two halves of a whole that was stronger than either could ever be alone. That was the promise they had made in a dungeon cell so many years ago, when a beast had recognized the presence of the one person who refused to abandon him. And it was a promise they would keep, every night and every day, for the rest of their lives. Every night she had returned to the sleeping beast, until it recognized her presence. And in that recognition, in that moment of connection between the broken and the brave, a love had been born that would transform not just two people, but an entire kingdom. That was the power of compassion, the miracle of redemption, the truth that even in the deepest darkness, a single light could be enough to show the way home.